Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. In today's episode, Mr. Cosmic tries to prove that morality is subjective by defining it as subjective. And I am not the only one who had a problem with this video. Inspiring Philosophy did a rebuttal of their own, one that gets a little more intellectual than I'm capable of getting into, but I will leave a link in the description. And also, someone who commented on Mr. Cosmic's video, which I will be referring to, since it did such a good job of pointing out some of the errors. So, let's begin.
So let's get going with this. First, I need to define what I actually mean by morality, and this isn't as simple as it seems. I saw a clip of Tracy Harris on the Atheist Experience recently arguing with someone, and she proposed what I think is a good way to understand what we mean when we say morality. She asked the caller to imagine that he was trying to determine whether or not a dog had moral tendencies. What would we look for in that dog or in the dog's psychology to determine whether or not it's a moral agent? This helps us pinpoint precisely what we mean by morality. Now, Tracy argued that we would look for a recognition of certain concepts like fairness and empathy, and if the dog recognizes fairness, for instance, and acts in a way to procure it, we can call it a moral agent. Now, I think Tracy's great, but I can't agree with this. Let me give you an example to explain why. Imagine we were to design a robot, and we programmed it to be selfless and bring about what we, the programmers, felt was fairness. As the robot goes about its business, fulfilling its programming and procuring fairness, could you call it a moral agent when it's just fulfilling the commands of its programming? I don't think you could, even though it technically has a recognition of the concept of fairness. I think there's more to it than that. I think morality is twofold. First, it entails a recognition that some things are good and others are bad. And secondly, and this isn't the same thing, an intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not do that which is bad. I'll dive more into that soon, but the reason that I think we need this, more than just a recognition of concepts like fairness, to be encompassed into our definition, is because the reason I wouldn't call our robot a moral agent is because it has no recognition of good or bad or any concept of moral ought. It procures fairness because it's programmed to, not because it feels that it should. If it did have an experience of ought, we may well call it a moral agent. So that's why I define morality in this way. So I suppose I would define morality as the intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not to do that which is bad. This definition is incredibly broad, of course, but with good reason. The reason is that it can encompass all popular notions of morality, and so we don't need to fall at the first hurdle. For instance, Sam Harris's notion that we ought to do that which brings about well-being, and thinking that well-being is good, is a belief that we ought to do that which is good. It fits our definition. Religious morality too fits into it, since the religious feel we ought to do that which God has defined as good. This is why I think this is the best definition of morality to start with, because it's broad enough that we can all agree with it. But it's important to keep in mind that the definition is composed of two parts, the good and bad, and the ought and ought not. They're not the same thing, and we'll see why this is so important shortly. But now, of course, we run into the problem of defining what we mean by good, or bad, or ought, since we're using these words in our definition. You might say that these terms need themselves to be independently defined within our broader definition. But the reason I haven't done so is because I believe it's impossible to do so. You'll hopefully understand this by the end of the video, but my whole point here is that the reason morality can't be objective is precisely because good, bad, and ought can't be defined. I subscribe to G.E. Moore's notion that good is like the colour yellow. It has no synonyms. It can't be described to someone who's never experienced it. Nonetheless, you know what I mean by yellow, and you know what I mean by good. Even if you disagree when I call a particular thing good, the very fact that you can disagree demonstrates that you still know what I mean by good, even whilst disagreeing that that particular thing is good. For instance, Sam Harris might say, and has said, that throwing acid in the face of a girl is not good. If someone were to claim that doing so actually is good, they clearly have a wildly different moral philosophy, and yet to even be able to disagree, they must still know what Harris means by good. The moment we attempt to define good, as in to give it a synonym, we necessarily have to presume a particular moral philosophy. I might define good as what God commands, or as what procures well-being, but to do so I would automatically be agreeing with a certain philosophy. And this is why I haven't defined good, bad, or ought in my definition. Again, this should be more clear by the end of the video. So that's the definition of morality I'm working with. Morality is the conception that we ought to do that which is good and ought not do that which is bad. We can have a wealth of disagreement over whether or not a particular thing is good or bad, but we can still agree that if it is good, whatever that means, we ought to do it, and if it is bad, whatever that means, we ought not. You might think this definition is broad, but that doesn't make it wrong.
So first, let's get into why I claim his definition of morality is redundant. As the YouTube commenter pointed out, ought is implicit in the notion of good. So you're asking, in effect, if we ought to do what we ought. Mr. Cosmic said himself that we all know what good and bad is without being able to define it, much like trying to define the color yellow, which means everybody agrees that we ought to do good, because good can be defined as what we ought to do. Oh look, I just defined good. Good is that which we ought to do. That really wasn't that hard. I agree that everybody knows what we mean when we say good, but that also means everybody should know that good and what we ought to do are the same thing. Now about that begging the question. As the YouTube commenter said, if morality is only a personal sense based upon intuition, then it naturally follows that it's subjective. You've assumed that which you set out to prove. Intuitions are inherently subjective. You can have an intuition about morality, but morality itself is not an intuition. Let's see what the actual dictionary defines morality as. The quality of being moral. A system of ideas of right and wrong conduct. Virtuous conduct. And let's just look at the definition of moral now. Of or concerned with the judgment or instruction of goodness or badness of character and behavior, conforming to established standards of good behavior. Now those are some good definitions of morality.
So this is perhaps the most surprising of the claims I'm making, that even if God exists, morality is still subjective. In fact, a popular argument employed by the religious to discount atheism is precisely that atheism can't provide an objective basis for morality. Here's Dr. William Lane Craig admitting that one reason he believes in God is simply because he can't bring himself to think that the Holocaust wasn't objectively bad.
I'm convinced that there really are objective moral duties and values, that the Holocaust is not just something that is wrong relative to Western democratic standards, but right for the Nazis, so that if the Nazis had won World War II and everybody believed the Holocaust was good on that atheistic view, then it really would have been good. That to me is morally unconscionable. I think that's just false.
Did you catch that? He thinks that it's morally unconscionable that morality is purely subjective, which makes him think that it's false. He also thinks that religion provides objective morality where atheism doesn't, and this is one of the reasons he's religious. Does this betray a value of comfort and convenience over a value of truth? Perhaps. Here's him doing it again.
Because it leads to a worldview which is, I think, unlivable. It's incapable of being lived consistently and happily. You cannot live consistently and happily as though moral values and duties are just the results of feelings and subjective impressions. You're going to want to say, for example, that apartheid was really wrong, that the killing fields of Cambodia were really wrong. And you can't do that if it's just based in feelings.
Now, putting aside the fact that Dr. Craig dismisses morality based solely on feelings because he feels it's uncomfortable, this is a very common argument, and an effective one too. Dr. Craig is right that most people long for a way to objectively protect and justify their moral intuitions, and many find this in God. But if I can show that even with God, morality is still subjective, this argument crumbles. So why does Dr. Craig feel that atheism can't provide a basis for objective morality?
Well, because if morality is just based in feelings and relationships with other people and the way we were raised, by our parents and society, then it's all relative. Someone who has different feelings or raised in a different society might have a vastly different set of values and moral duties, and therefore it's not objective, it's purely subjective.
Okay, so that's crucial. Note the usage of the word therefore. Dr. Craig says that atheistic morality can vary depending on a person's upbringing, their geographical and social background, their environment, which therefore shows that it's subjective, because it wouldn't be variable if it were objective. So it seems by that logic that if I can show that religious morality can vary in the same way, it too is therefore subjective. And of course, a moment's reflection allows us to realize that religious views too, obviously, vary in exactly the same way. A person's religion is, more often than not, determined by their social and geographical background, just as atheistic morality is. But okay, I can already hear the sound of religious objection. Of course religious views vary, but that's not because my religion is only subjectively correct. It still has an objectively true morality. It's just that other people have gotten it wrong and follow a false morality because they feel that their religion is objectively true when it really isn't. My morality is still objective, even if other people have gotten it wrong. But there are two problems with this. Firstly, the exact same could be said of atheistic claims to objective morality. Of course, atheistic morality varies by social and geographical backgrounds, but that doesn't mean it's not objective, just that other people have gotten it wrong. It's the same thing. But secondly, and more crucially, the only reason that anybody could possibly choose one religious morality as more ethically viable than another is because they feel it provides a better framework for moral truth. How else could a person possibly prove to themselves or to others that one religion has a superior ethical code to another? How else can a Christian possibly believe that the ethical code of Christianity is superior to that of Islam? If you want to compare the ethics of two religions, you need some moral basis on which to judge them. But that moral basis obviously can't be one of the religions, and so the only way that you can decide which religion is morally superior is through a subjective analysis of which you feel is better. It's ultimately a subjective decision based on your, not your religion's, moral intuition.
There is so much wrong with this clip, I don't know where to start. You really start to see how, like Inspiring Philosophy said, he keeps switching back and forth between different concepts and or definitions of morality, such as ontological and epistemological. Let's start again by going to the YouTube commenter. The impulses that compel a person to choose one religion over another are morally irrelevant. A person's choice has no bearing on whether the moral system is right or wrong. Defining morality as a collection of subjective individual choices is just another example of question begging. Also, I'll add that your notion that people choose their religion is contrary to your belief in the impossibility of free will. I also love how Mr. Cosmic conflates truth with objectivity. There is a section in there where he's talking about objectivity as if it were synonymous with truth, which is just hilariously ironic. All, or at least most, religions have an objective morality, and there are two ways to prove that one morality is better than another. The first is by appealing to the moral intuitions that we all have. The second is by appealing to the idea that one religion is true and the other is false. For instance, if I want to claim that Christianity is morally superior to Islam, I can appeal to moral intuitions by just showing that Muhammad was a pedophile. Or I could show that Islam is a false religion, not based in any actual truth, and that Christianity is true based on repeatedly verified facts and philosophical necessity. Whichever religion is true, that is the morally superior religion. The only religion that would not be morally superior, even if it were true, is any religion that would say that morality is subjective. Because if morality is subjective, then morality does not exist.
But still, and interestingly, something tells me that Dr. Craig wouldn't accuse, say, a Muslim of having subjective morality, even though he thinks that their morality is objectively false, since it contradicts Christianity. The religious point the finger at atheism for having subjective morality, but not at other religions. Why not? What's the difference in a Christian's eyes between atheistic morality and Islamic morality? What makes one able to claim that their morality is objective, but the other not? Clearly, neither can actually be objectively true, according to the Christian, because they both contradict Christianity. So the only difference is that the Muslim believes their morality to be objective, even though it isn't, according to the Christian, whereas the atheist doesn't. And suddenly, we're once again in the realm of subjectivity. The only thing that seems to distinguish religious morality from atheistic morality, even according to the religious here, is that the religious believer feels like their morality is objective, whereas the atheist recognizes the subjectivity lying at the heart of ethical decision-making. The reason that Craig wouldn't accuse a Muslim of subjective morality is therefore not because their morality is objective, which he obviously doesn't believe, but because they feel that it's objective and treat it as though it's such. Think, one of Craig's objections to subjective morality is that he says that a person can't possibly live a happy life assuming that morality is subjective. But this shows that his criteria for a claim to objectivity is not actual objectivity, but simply the belief in objectivity, and acting as though morality is objective, even if it isn't. Therefore, we can see that the religious claim to objective moral values is ultimately based on two things: a subjective recognition of the superiority of a person's particular religion, and the feeling, rather than the fact, that the morality of that religion is objective, even if it actually isn't. It's all subjective. But look, I've got more. If you're not with me already, try this as a final nail. Let's forget everything I've just said about religious morality. Or let's say that you agree with what I've said, but you just don't think that your religious morality is based on a subjective recognition of the moral superiority of your religion, but rather on the objective evidence that your God exists. This, I'm sure, will be a common rebuttal. You believe that your religious morality is true, not because you've judged it to be ethically superior, but because you think that the God of your religion has been proven to exist, or your religion proven to be otherwise factually accurate. So, okay, I'll grant you it. Let's say that somehow we were to objectively demonstrate that a particular God, say the God of Christianity, exists. We know this for a fact. You might say that if this is the case, religious morality is objective, because if God is the author of everything, then it's he who determines what is good and what is bad, objectively. Clearly, if God exists and has objectively defined certain things as good and bad, we can objectively determine how we ought to behave. Morality is objective, right? Well, there's actually still a hidden assumption within this, and this is why earlier I was so stressing the importance of understanding morality in the two parts that I defined. Firstly, a recognition of good and bad, but also the idea that we ought to do what's good and not what's bad. So here's the single question that completely changed the way that I view religious morality. Why ought we do that which is good? I want you to really think about this because it's crucial. Why ought we do that which is good? Let's say that good really was defined by God. We've said that we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the God of Christianity really does exist, and really did write, for instance, the Ten Commandments, let's say. We can therefore objectively say that murder, adultery, bearing false witness, etc. are bad, objectively. That's not enough. You still need to demonstrate objectively that because something is good, we ought to do it, and because something is bad, we ought not do it. Of course, it seems stupidly obvious and absolutely instinctive that we ought to do what's good. Of course we ought to do what's good, but can you prove it? Just because it's instinctive doesn't mean it's true. Let's not forget the basic premise of skepticism, which is to take nothing for granted. The idea that we ought to do that which is good is a subjective impulse that cannot be demonstrated to be objectively true, even if good can be. And so even if God really did exist, and even if he really did define good and bad, there's still no way to objectively determine how we ought to behave. It's still reliant on subjectivity. Now, the religious might respond that of course we can prove that we ought to do that which is good, because God commands us to do that which is good. God defines good, and God commands us to do that which is good, and so morality is objective. But you've got two problems. Firstly, you just push the issue back. I can still ask why I ought to do what God commands, and any answer you give me can just be questioned in the same way. We ought to do what God commands because God is good, so why ought I do that which is good? Because God commands it? You've got yourself a circle. But secondly, consider that a command contains no truth value. If I say, go and follow me on Twitter, is that true or false? It's neither, because a command can't be true or false, it just is. So even if God commands us to do that which is good, that commandment can't be objectively true. Whether it's a command we should follow or not is simply based on whether or not we recognize God's authority. Now, of course, God commands that we recognize his authority, or you might argue that we know that God's authority is good. But you can't prove that we should follow his command to recognize his authority, and you can't prove that because his authority is good, we ought to recognize it. It's still ultimately a subjective instinct that we ought to do that which is good. And even if it weren't, it would be based on circular logic and so invalid. Thus, if it means anything, religious morality is subjective. Now, don't get me wrong here. I am, like I say, a moral subjectivist myself, and so, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with constructing a moral framework based in subjectivity, as I'm claiming the religious do, as long as the framework is recognized as such. All I'm saying is that whilst religious morality claims to be objective, it is in fact ultimately subjective, and so needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper or grounded ethics. So that's my coverage of religious morality.
So, as you can see, Mr. Cosmic's entire video hinges on that very fallacious definition of morality he started with, most notably trying to separate what we ought to do with what is good. Whatever is good is what we ought to do, by definition. I actually thought about going to the dictionary again to see what it says about good, but it says too much. There are just too many definitions of good to put them all in here. Now about circular logic. Circular logic, by definition, is valid. All valid means is that the conclusion follows from the premise, and in circular reasoning, the conclusion always follows from the premise. If it didn't follow from the premise, it would not be circular, and since it follows from the premise, it is valid. Now, Mr. Cosmic could have said circular logic is always unsound, and I don't think I would agree with that, but I would have ignored it, probably. On second thought, no, I probably would not have ignored it. You can indeed make a circular argument that is both valid and sound. The question would be that if you do that, are you even making an argument? And it's even abundantly more clear in this clip how he keeps switching back and forth between objective and objectively true, which ends up just making it sound like he thinks to be objective is to be true. But that would mean that to be subjective is to be false. I gotta say, this is probably one of the messiest videos, philosophically speaking, that Mr. Cosmic has ever made to this point.